The candlelight in that rented back room at Verano's threw soft shadows across 25 faces, all of them holding raised glasses toward the head of the table. My name is Josephine Renner. Everyone calls me Jo. I'm 51 years old, and for 17 years I've managed corporate events and vendor contracts for a hospitality group, trained to know exactly where every dollar of a shared bill actually ends up. My sister-in-law Paulette leaned toward the woman beside her, a cousin's wife named Delphine, and whispered something she clearly thought was quiet enough. Total gold digger. It carried. Just far enough for me to hear it perfectly over the toast being given 3 seats down, my husband Nate's cousin raising a glass to 15 years of marriage, to us. I want you to understand something before I tell you how we got to that whisper. By the time dessert came out that night, I had already made 1 phone call. And the next card the waiter asked for at that table wouldn't be mine. I lifted my own glass. I smiled at the toast, the way you smile when everyone around you expects you to. I didn't turn my head toward Paulette. I didn't ask Delphine to repeat what she'd just heard, though her face told me she'd heard it too, and hadn't expected me to. I just sat there, glass raised, candlelight catching the rim of it, and I let the moment pass the way I've let so many moments pass in that family. I want to tell you about the 9 years I quietly paid for my sister-in-law's seat at every table she ever sat at. And the one whisper it took for me to finally stop. Welcome back to Calm Destruction Stories. This one's for anyone who's ever quietly funded a family member's seat at the table, while that same person told everyone else a story about who really belongs there. If that's you, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if that whisper of Paulette sounded like a voice from your own family, tell me that too. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, long before Verano's became a habit, long before any of it needed proving. For 17 years, I've worked as a senior events and vendor contracts manager for a hospitality company, which means I spend my days negotiating catering contracts, reconciling banquet invoices, and reviewing house accounts to make sure no charge slips passed unexamined. That's the whole job, really. Someone has to look at a bill after everyone else has signed off on it and ask whether it actually reflects what happened. Years ago, I caught a venue quietly double billing one of our corporate clients for the same open bar, listed once under beverage service and once under a vague line item called event enhancements, across 2 consecutive company galas. The client's own finance team had missed it both times. I hadn't. I flagged the discrepancy, requested the itemized pour logs, and had the second charge reversed within a week, without ever needing to raise my voice about it. People sometimes mistake that kind of steadiness for accommodation, like I simply let things slide because confrontation makes me uncomfortable. It's not that. I don't make a scene over a bill because I trust that a ledger, given enough time, tells the truth on its own. You don't need to shout at a number. You just need to keep reading it. At home, my husband Nate has always been the peacemaker, the one who smooths over an awkward silence at dinner before anyone else even notices it's there. I've always been the one who just takes care of it, whatever it is, especially when a gathering's bill comes due and somebody at the table starts patting their pockets a little too theatrically. Nobody ever assigned me that role. It simply became understood, the way certain things in families settle into place without anyone agreeing to them out loud. That habit of just taking care of it is exactly what led me, 9 years ago, to open a running account at a restaurant that would go on to host every family gathering after it, including the very anniversary dinner where Paulette leaned over and decided my marriage was something worth whispering about. The first big family dinner after Nate's father retired, we all gathered at a steakhouse near his parents' house, 12 of us squeezed around a table meant for 10. Curtis reached into his jacket when the check came, patted it twice, and announced he'd left his wallet in the other coat. My mother-in-law waved a hand before anyone could even react. "We'll sort it out later," she said, already reaching for her own purse instead. It happened again at Thanksgiving that same year. Curtis again, the wallet again, the same easy laugh from him and the same wave from my mother-in-law. By the 3rd time, at a spring birthday dinner for one of the cousins, I stopped waiting for anyone else to reach for their card. I paid it myself, quietly, the way you'd step in to catch something before it hit the floor. Nobody ever sorted anything out later. Later never came. If I had to name what was actually happening in that family, I'd call it the seat nobody pays for. Without anyone ever discussing it out loud, Paulette and Curtis had become the branch of the family whose presence at any gathering was simply assumed to be someone else's responsibility to cover. Not because they couldn't afford it. Because somewhere along the way, the family had quietly decided that was simply how it worked, and nobody, including me, ever said otherwise. Paulette has always been quick with a compliment when she thinks it matters who's listening. She'll tell you your dress is lovely, ask after your job with real-sounding interest, hug you a beat longer than necessary at the door. She's quicker with something else entirely once she's decided the room has emptied out enough. I'd heard the edges of it before, comments about how some people marry into a life rather than build one, comments that never quite landed on me directly, but never missed me by much either. I think she genuinely believed, underneath all of it, that whatever comfort Nate and I had built together had simply been handed to me, the way Curtis's wallet always seemed to stay in his other coat. I never corrected any of it. I paid the dinners, I smiled through the compliments, I let the sharper comments pass like weather. I told myself that if I just kept covering the gap, both the financial one and the one in what people believed about me, I was keeping the peace. For 9 years, I believed that was the same thing as being respected. That belief held right up until the anniversary dinner where Paulette finally said out loud what she'd apparently been thinking the entire time. At Nate's mother's birthday dinner the year before, a smaller gathering of maybe 14 of us at a place near her house, I stepped away from the table to take a call from work and caught the tail end of Paulette's voice on my way back, low but not low enough, talking to Renata, one of Nate's cousins who'd flown in for the weekend. She married up, Paulette said, and she never lets anyone forget it. I stood just outside the doorway for a second, holding my phone, and I let that land away. You let a wrong number settle before you hang up. I have never once, in 17 years of marriage, mentioned who pays for a dinner at any family gathering. I've never brought it up, never hinted at it, never used it as leverage in an argument. The accusation didn't match anything I'd actually done. It only matched something Paulette had apparently already decided about me long before that dinner. I noted the date without meaning to, the way I note things out of habit, and I noted that Renata had been standing right there to hear it. I walked back to the table, sat down, and finished my dinner like nothing had happened. Later that week, I logged into the account I'd set up at Verano's years earlier and renewed the standing arrangement the way I did every year around that time, the one that automatically applied a family discount to any gathering booked there and quietly absorbed whatever shortfall was left on Paulette and Curtis's portion of the bill. Neither of them had ever seen an itemized total. They never needed to. The account handled it before it ever reached their hands. I didn't mention any of it to Nate. Not the renewal, not what I'd overheard in that doorway. I've never liked handing him something to smooth over that was actually mine to carry. I want you to sit with that contrast for a second, because I did. In the same week Paulette told her cousin I'd married up and never let anyone forget it, I was quietly renewing the exact arrangement that had been letting her family eat comfortably at my expense for years, without either of us ever mentioning it to a single person in that family. I confirmed the renewal, closed my laptop, and let the evening close the way it always did. Quietly. Without comment. Nate mentioned it in passing one evening, barely looking up from his plate. Curtis had asked him for the name of your usual place, meaning Verano's, because he wanted to book it himself for a client dinner he was hosting. Nate said it like it was nothing, a small favor between brothers-in-law. Something in me went still for a second. Curtis had never once asked why our family always ended up at Verano's, never questioned why the private room was always available, why the bill always seemed to resolve itself so smoothly at the end of the night. It struck me, sitting there with my fork halfway to my plate, that he'd never had reason to ask. He had never once seen a bill with his own name attached to it. 9 years of dinners, and not a single itemized total had ever crossed his hands. That standing account, opened quietly under my name 9 years earlier and renewed every year, since without a word to anyone in the family, had made the whole arrangement invisible to the one person who might have noticed it. Curtis didn't know it existed. He simply believed Verano's was generous, or convenient, or ours in some vague collective sense. He had no idea it was mine. Around that same week, Nate's mother mentioned to me, entirely without malice, that Paulette had been telling people at a church that she and Curtis always treat the family to their favorite restaurant. I turned that sentence over for a long moment after she said it, because I couldn't find a single transaction anywhere that traced back to either of their names. Not one dinner. Not one deposit. Not one card on file that wasn't mine. I want to ask you something, if you don't mind me pausing here. If you've ever quietly paid for someone's seat at the table while they told everyone else they were the ones doing the treating, tell me in the comments how long you let that version stand before it actually started to bother you. For me, it had already been years, and I still hadn't said a single word to correct it. I didn't correct Nate's mother. I didn't call Paulette to ask why her name kept attaching itself to a generosity that had never once come out of her own pocket. I filed it away instead, mentally, next to the doorway conversation with Renata and the account I'd renewed without telling anyone, and I told myself I was simply gathering the full shape of it before deciding anything needed saying at all. That's the thing about reconciling an account for a living. You don't act on a single number that looks wrong. You wait to see if it's a pattern, because a pattern is the only thing that actually tells you the truth of a ledger. So I decided to keep watching, the way I've learned to watch an invoice long enough for its full shape to surface before I ever act on it. Watching quietly is second nature to me by now. And the next thing I noticed cost me far more than a false story about who treats whom at a dinner table. The room was full that night, 25 of us tucked into Verano's private dining room, candlelight catching the edges of the water glasses, while Nate's cousin stood at the head of the table giving his toast. That's when Paulette leaned toward Delphine, close, her hand half cupped near her mouth in a way that should have kept it private. Total gold digger. It carried anyway, riding just under the toast, landing exactly where she hadn't meant it to. My mother, seated 2 chairs down, heard it too. I watched her face go carefully blank, the particular stillness of someone who's decided that reacting would only make the moment louder. This wasn't a doorway comment meant for a cousin's ears in another room. This was said at my own anniversary dinner, 15 years, in front of both families, in front of the people whose good opinion actually mattered to me. I didn't turn my head. I kept my glass raised through the rest of the toast, and somewhere across the room, I caught Teo Alves watching me. Teo had handled my account at Verano's personally for 9 years, had walked me through every renewal, every adjustment, every quiet correction on an invoice I'd ever flagged. He gave me the smallest nod, barely a movement, the kind of nod that told me he'd heard exactly where that whisper had come from, and exactly what end of the table it had landed near. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would have been the easier feeling, honestly, the one that burns off fast and leaves you lighter. What I felt instead was quieter and colder, the same feeling I get at my desk when an invoice stops matching what actually happened, and I understand, all at once, that it was never going to match, because it was never supposed to. I was doing what I always do. I was starting to think about what the account records would actually show, if anyone bothered to pull them. I excused myself a few minutes later, murmuring something about the ladies' room, and walked past the bar toward the hallway where the noise of the party thinned out behind me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text Nate to tell him what I'd heard, though I would later, once I'd had a chance to sit with it myself first. I stood by the window at the end of that hallway, phone in hand, and opened a blank note. I didn't need to write much. Just a title, something that didn't need to be clever, because no one else would ever think to look for it. I named it, simply, Verano's. That note didn't stay short for long. Once I start reviewing an account properly, I've never once found it stopped at just the surface number. I called Teo the following Monday and asked him for the full transaction history on the Verano's house account, everything he had going back 9 years. He pulled it without asking why, the way you do for a client whose account you've personally handled through every renewal since the beginning. I sat with that history at my kitchen table for most of an afternoon, matching each family gathering against the discounted totals automatically applied to Paulette and Curtis's portion of the bill. It's the same work I do for a living, reconciling a banquet invoice line by line, until the numbers actually match the story they're supposed to tell. I'd braced myself for a large number. I hadn't braced myself for this one. Just over $47,000. That was the cumulative total I had personally absorbed across 9 years of dinners, birthdays, holidays, all of it filed under a family discount, and a shortfall coverage clause I'd set up myself and renewed every year, without saying a word to anyone. 9 years of it's nothing, don't worry about it, and the actual number had never once lived anywhere but inside that account. I read the account notes twice, the way I read everything twice before I trust it. The arrangement had always required my specific authorization to apply the discount and cover whatever the discount didn't. Not a general family policy. Not something built into the restaurant's own terms. Mine, specifically, every single time, meaning nothing about Paulette and Curtis's comfortable dining habit had ever depended on a dollar of their own money. I cross-referenced the dates against what Nate's mother had told me, Paulette's comments at church about how she and Curtis always treated the family to their favorite restaurant. I searched every transaction on that 9-year history for any trace of Curtis's name, any card, any deposit, anything at all connecting either of them to a single payment. There was nothing. Not $1. Not one signature. His name didn't appear anywhere in 9 years of invoices because he had never once been part of them. I sat there with the account history open on my laptop and understood something with a clarity I hadn't let myself reach before. Paulette's entire image of generous hosting, every version of it she'd ever told a cousin or a church friend, had rested on my authorization the whole time. Not on her own resources. Not on anything Curtis had ever put forward. Mine, quietly, for 9 years, a fact she had clearly let herself forget completely, if she'd ever actually let herself know it at all. Knowing what I'd covered was one thing. Knowing exactly how to stop covering it without turning a family dinner into a scene was going to be the harder part. I called Teo again a few days later and asked him directly whether the account authorization could simply be revoked at my discretion. He confirmed it in plain terms, the same steady tone he uses for any question about the account. Since the arrangement had been set up solely under my name from the beginning, I could remove my authorization from any future booking with a single written request, effective immediately once he received it. I decided against confronting Paulette privately. I also decided against saying anything at the next small family gathering, the kind where a conversation like that would only turn into something everyone felt obligated to referee. Instead, I chose to let the arrangement simply lapse the very next time the account was used, without announcing anything ahead of it. No speech. No warning. Just the quiet end of something that had never been acknowledged to begin with. In the weeks that followed, Paulette kept talking. She told a woman at her church group how well she and Curtis took care of everyone at their favorite restaurant. She mentioned it again on a family call, a little more polished than the last version, the details growing smoother the more times she repeated them. Each retelling sounded a little more certain than the one before it, and I noticed that certainty, left alone long enough, has a way of hardening into something a person genuinely believes about themselves. She had no idea the account behind that generosity already had an expiration filed with Teo's office, dated, waiting. I want you to sit with that contrast the way I did, because it followed me through those weeks. She was growing more confident by the day. I was growing more clear about exactly what 9 years of covering her had actually cost me, in dollars, and in every quiet moment, I'd let a false version of myself stand uncorrected at somebody else's table. The night after the anniversary dinner, the same night Paulette had leaned toward Delphine and whispered what she'd apparently been thinking all along, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop open and wrote Teo a short plain email. I asked him to formally withdraw my authorization from the Verano's account, effective the next time it was booked. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. I read it once before I sent it, the way I read anything before it leaves my hands. With that email gone, all that was left now was for the consequence to arrive exactly where Paulette's confidence lived. At a table. In front of people. With a card that wouldn't do what she expected it to. 6 weeks later, the family gathered again at Verano's, the same private room, the same 25 or so familiar faces settling into their seats for Nate's mother's 80th birthday. Paulette arrived early, cheerful in that particular way she gets when she's certain of her footing, telling the hostess at the front that she just put it all on our usual arrangement. I watched Teo cross the room a few minutes later, and he gave me the same brief professional nod he'd given me at the anniversary, nothing more than that, the nod of a man who already knows exactly how this evening ends and has decided it isn't his place to say so first. Paulette signed the pre-dinner form near the hostess stand without reading it, the way she'd apparently never needed to read it before, her pen moving fast across a line she'd signed a dozen times without a second thought. I want to ask you something, if you let me. If you've ever watched someone confidently plan around a generosity you'd already quietly withdrawn, you know that watching isn't spite. Sometimes it's just letting the truth arrive on its own schedule, instead of announcing it yourself before it's ready. Tell me if you've ever had to let something play out like that, instead of saying it out loud first. We ate. Nate's mother opened cards and told a story about her own mother that made half the table laugh. Curtis refilled wine glasses down at his end without a single thought in his head about what was coming. Paulette leaned over at one point and told Renata, again, how nice it was that she and Curtis could always take care of a night like this one. I didn't say anything. I ate my dinner, talked with my mother-in-law about her garden, and let the evening move at its own pace, the same pace it had moved at for 9 years. As the dinner wound down, plates cleared, coffee poured, I saw the waiter start making his way toward Paulette's end of the table, the small leather check presenter tucked under his arm the way it always is at the end of a meal like this one. The waiter ran Paulette's card first, the family's portion of the bill folded neatly inside the leather presenter. He stepped away for a moment, the way they do, and came back with a small, apologetic shake of his head. The card had declined. Paulette laughed it off, easy, unbothered, already reaching into her purse for a second card. "Machines," she said, glancing around the table like she expected someone to laugh with her. The second card declined too. I watched her smile hold for a second longer than it should have, the way a smile does right before it starts to understand something. The waiter leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low and professional. He explained, briefly, that the automatic family discount and coverage that had previously applied to this table was no longer active on the account. Paulette turned to me, half joking, half demanding, "The way you talk to someone you still expect to fix things for you. What is he talking about?" I set down my napkin. "For 9 years, I was the one who authorized that discount and covered whatever it didn't, Paulette," I said, evenly. "I never once mentioned it because I didn't think a family should need reminding of who takes care of who. I'm not authorizing it anymore for someone who called me a gold digger at my own anniversary dinner. I didn't reach for anything dramatic. I didn't pull out a printed statement and lay it across the tablecloth. I simply looked toward Teo, who had already stepped quietly over from the doorway, and asked if he wouldn't mind confirming the account history, in case anyone at the table wanted to hear it plainly. He did, brief and factual, the same tone he uses for any account question, naming the 9 years, naming that the authorization had always run through my name alone. For a moment, nobody at that table moved. Then it started, in pieces, the way a room does once something true has finally been said out loud, instead of whispered sideways at someone else's expense. Curtis went very still, his fork stopped halfway to his plate, his eyes moving slowly from the check presenter to his wife. Nate's mother's eyebrows lifted slightly over the rim of her water glass, the smallest, most controlled reaction I'd ever seen from her, though I could tell it wasn't small on the inside. Paulette's mouth opened. I watched her search for the next thing to say, the reflex of someone who has never once, in all the years I've known her, been without a quick response ready to go. Nothing arrived. She looked down at the declined card still sitting in the presenter, her fingers hovering near it without actually touching it, as though touching it again might somehow change what it had just told everyone at that table. I didn't fill the silence for her. I've spent 17 years learning that the truest test of a number isn't how loudly you announce it, it's what happens when you simply let it sit there, plain, for people to read for themselves. I let the check presenter sit. I let Teo's brief explanation sit. I let the quiet stretch out across a table that had, 9 years running and every gathering before this one, depended entirely on an authorization nobody at that table had ever once thanked me for. Renata, seated further down, glanced between Paulette and me, and I could see her doing the same arithmetic I'd done alone at my kitchen table weeks earlier, 9 years compressed into 2 declined cards and 1 quiet sentence. Paulette finally spoke, her voice thinner than I'd heard it in years. I don't understand what she didn't finish it. Whatever she'd meant to say caught somewhere before it reached the rest of the sentence, and she set the card down on the table next to the presenter, as though putting distance between herself and it might undo what it had already said. A silence like that one doesn't stay silent for long. Not with everyone who mattered to her version of herself sitting right there, watching the number say what I had never needed to say myself. Paulette's composure broke first as disbelief, her eyes moving from the check presenter to my face, as though hoping one of us would turn out to be a misunderstanding she could still talk her way out of. Then she reached for something steadier. "I never said anything like that," she said. "Someone's exaggerating." Her voice caught on the word exaggerating, the syllables losing their footing halfway through. Her hand shook slightly, setting the declined card back into her purse, the clasp fumbling once before it caught. Curtis hadn't said a word yet. He turned toward Teo, his voice low, careful, the first time in 9 years he'd ever asked the question out loud. "How long," he said, "has the account been covering our portion?" Teo answered him plainly, the same factual tone he'd used a moment earlier, and I watched something settle behind Curtis's eyes as the number landed, 9 years compressing into a single sentence he'd never once thought to ask before that night. Nate didn't say anything either. He reached over and rested his hand briefly on my shoulder, not gripping, just steady, there, the kind of gesture that said more than any defense of me could have. Delphine had been watching Paulette closely since the card first declined, quieter than I'd ever seen her at a family table. "I heard what you said to me at the anniversary, Paulette," she said, careful but unflinching. "I didn't think it meant anything until now." Paulette opened her mouth. Nothing came out of it. She looked at Delphine the way you look at someone who has just handed you back a sentence you'd assumed was yours alone to forget. I didn't say anything else. I'd already said what needed saying, plainly, once, and I've never believed in repeating a true thing, simply because the table hasn't fully absorbed it yet. I sat with my hands folded at the edge of the tablecloth, the same posture I hold through any difficult negotiation, and I let my sister-in-law sit with what Curtis had just asked, what Delphine had just said, what Nate's hand on my shoulder had already answered without a single word. Nate's mother quietly reached for her water glass and took a slow sip, her eyes moving once around the table before settling back on her plate, saying nothing, letting the moment belong to whoever was actually in it. Renata stood first, murmuring something about needing to use the restroom, though I think we all understood she simply needed somewhere else to be for a minute. Other guests shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, at the check presenter still sitting untouched near Paulette's end of the table, at the plates in front of them that nobody seemed interested in finishing anymore. Eventually, one of the younger cousins reached for his wallet, quietly asking the person next to him what they thought they each owed. It spread from there, guest by guest, everyone at that end of the table pulling out cards and phones, splitting the remaining bill among themselves in an awkward, murmured round that nobody wanted to be the one to organize out loud. Paulette sat very still through all of it, her own card still resting inside her purse, untouched, unresolved, while the rest of the table quietly did what she had never once had to do herself. In the weeks that followed, Curtis set up his own payment method for family gatherings going forward, the first time in 9 years he'd ever handled that responsibility himself. He thanked me quietly, a little awkwardly, at a smaller family lunch about a month later, catching me alone near the coat rack. "I didn't realize," he said, "that you'd apparently been carrying us for years." I told him it was fine. I meant it, mostly. Paulette's version of her own generosity quietly stopped circulating at church not long after that. Delphine mentioned, unprompted, what she'd actually witnessed to a few of the same women who'd heard the earlier claims, and stories like Paulette's don't tend to survive long once the people repeating them have seen the numbers for themselves. I didn't cut Paulette out of family life. I still go to the same gatherings. I still speak to her at holidays, still ask after her garden, still pass the rolls when she reaches for them. What changed is simpler than a severance. I never restored the account, and I never again let anyone's bill become invisible in my name. That's a boundary, not an ending. Teo checked in with me a few weeks later, the same easy professional tone he's always had, and told me he was glad I'd finally let the account speak for itself, instead of carrying it silently the way I had for 9 years. We didn't make more of it than that. Our rapport continues exactly as it always has, steady, unshowy, built on nothing more complicated than mutual respect for an accurate ledger. Paulette called me once, about a month after that dinner, her voice different than I'd ever heard it on the phone. She said she'd spoken carelessly that night. It wasn't quite an apology, not really, not with my name attached to any real acknowledgement of what 9 years had actually cost me. But it was more than I'd ever expected to hear from her, and I decided to accept it for exactly what it was. No more than that. No less, either. I didn't ask her to say more. I've spent 17 years learning that some accounts simply close the way they close, imperfectly, without a clean final line drawn beneath them, and that insisting on a better ending than the one actually offered rarely gets you any closer to the truth. Months later, with every account at that table finally carrying its own real name instead of mine alone, I found myself standing somewhere quieter than vindication. Not triumphant. Not owed an apology I never fully got. Just steady, in a way I hadn't let myself be in longer than I wanted to admit. I've had time to sit with what I actually learned from that dinner, and it comes down to something simpler than I expected. Keeping the peace and keeping myself invisible were never the same thing. For 9 years I let the first stand in for the second, because it felt generous, when really it had just been convenient for everyone at that table but me. I think about that difference now on an ordinary Tuesday, sitting across from Nate at Verano's, just the two of us, splitting a bill in half without either of us thinking twice about it. My name's on the receipt this time because I ordered the wine, not because I'm quietly covering anyone else's eat. It's a small thing to notice, a folded receipt between 2 coffee cups, but it's the thing I hold on to now when I think about what actually changed. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's that generosity was never meant to be invisible. You can pay for someone's place at the table for years and still deserve to be seen clearly for what you gave. A quiet withdrawal is still a boundary, even when nobody claps for it, even when the person on the other end calls it something uglier than what it actually was. If this reminded you of someone who's been quietly footing a bill nobody ever thanked them for, tell me about it in the comments. And if you've ever had to let an account finally speak for itself, go ahead and subscribe, because these stories, every one of them, are for you.